What is justice? And how do rules or laws relate to justice? We find the word or the concept of justice in the Bible in a lot of places, particularly in the Old Testament prophets, but also in a lot of Jesus' teachings. Do we need rules and laws in order to have justice? And how does our modern perspective compare to the perspective of ancient times when Christ provided these teachings? So in modern terms, we tend to talk about law and justice in the same breath. Right? Laws are assumed to be related to justice, and we don't generally separate the two. We often think of justice in terms of someone being guilty or not guilty of breaking a law. So when someone who's guilty of a crime gets away with it, that feels like an injustice to us. And even worse, when somebody who is innocent gets punished instead, that can feel like even more of an injustice. Now, this is a very individualistic view of justice. It centers around an act of an individual who breaks a law or a societal rule. And from this point of view, for the most part, we assume that the law itself is just and fair and right. Or we often do. We make that assumption. We tend to assume it's the lawbreakers breaking individual that's the problem, not the law. But the Bible reminds us that laws are not always just. Or in other words, that laws are not always applied in a way that reflects justice. The civil rights movement in the 1960s was a great example of a movement driven by Christian ethics in response to unjust laws and practices, reminding us that laws are often unjust in and of themselves. Civil rights movement upended laws that were unjust and that targeted a specific group of people. Right? Most Jim Crow laws did not apply to white folks, right? Only to black people. Historically, when laws are adopted that apply to one group of people but not others, that should be a huge indication that maybe we need to look closer, that maybe there's injustice involved. So justice is complicated. It's not as simple as just deciding whether a law has been broken or not. Justice also requires that we consider whether the law is just and fair to begin with, and whether that law is being applied in a just way. Now, laws in Jesus' time were also complicated, but very different, in that the people of Israel actually had two sets of laws that they had to follow. They had Roman laws and Jewish laws, both. And so when we read and talk about law in the Bible, it's usually Jewish law that we're talking about, rather than Roman law. But realize that both sets of laws were in effect when Jesus was born. Jewish law included many things that Roman law did not include, such as extensive rules on what food you could eat, rules dealing with ritual purity, with cleanliness, and support for the temple. For example, under Jewish law, each person had to give 1/10 of their crops to support the temple priests. And you could not charge interest on a loan. That was another Jewish law. And you couldn't touch somebody who was labeled as unclean, for example. The scripture passage we read today from the book of Matthew, Jesus reminds us and mentions one of these Jewish laws directly. Jesus is dismayed. He's upset by how close some menial laws are kept, while much more important laws that impact the poor, were being totally ignored. Jewish law, as outlined in the Old Testament, required that 1/10 of livestock, of fruit trees, of grain, oil, and wine be presented to the temple. To make sure they complied with the law, some scribes and Pharisees even tithed their garden vegetables, the stuff they use for seasoning, well above and beyond what the law required. And that's what Jesus was talking about in today's passage. Jesus was calling out how these folks were following the law about tithing to a ridiculous degree, even including small spices like mint, dill, and cumin, while ignoring big stuff: justice, mercy, faith, trust, which Jesus sees as far more important. They were spending their time and attention on the little details while allowing huge injustices to go unnoticed. So Jesus said, you strain out a fly or a gnat, and then you swallow a camel. Some agricultural imagery there. So all laws are not equal to Jesus. Matters of justice, mercy, and trust are bigger and more important than many other laws. Now, unfortunately, the text doesn't explain what Jesus means by justice, mercy, and faith or trust in this teachings. But when we look at Christ's teachings as a whole, we find that Jesus is usually concerned about justice and mercy for the poor, the outcast, the sick, and the left behind. Right? There was plenty of mercy and justice for the wealthy in Jesus' time, but very little justice or mercy for the poor. Laws intended to make sure the poor, that orphans, that widows had enough to survive on were routinely ignored. When a poor person appeared before a judge in a case against a wealthy person, guess who usually won? When the Christian church was being created, as the first churches gathered and began teaching the way of Jesus, questions about law and justice came up a lot. Because of the non-Jewish diversity of the early church, Paul believed that forcing the new Christian churches to follow Jewish laws would be a disaster. So instead, Paul taught that our actions should be guided by what is best for all involved, not by what was dictated by old Jewish laws, or by any set of rules for that matter. That's what Paul was talking about in the passage we read today from 1 Corinthians. While we have certain rights as citizens and as Christians, we should never exercise our rights in a way that harms others. We should never exercise our rights in a way that harms somebody else. And Jesus' teachings went even further, telling us that laws must be beneficial to all, particularly the poor. When laws are not beneficial to all, it's almost always the poor who are mistreated, overlooked, or left behind. And humans, Jesus saw, have a tendency to get so focused on following a set of rules that we can miss the weightier matters of love, justice, mercy, particularly love for neighbor. We overlook that pretty easily. And so he talked about these things a lot in his teachings. And those teachings, Jesus' teachings about justice and mercy and loving God and our neighbor, have always been at the core of who we are as a church. That's why historically we've been willing to challenge rules and norms that separate people from Jesus' teachings. Many of you have heard the story of our church's founding before. I won't go into much detail, but our church started in 1894 because a group of people had felt called to reject their existing church's rules that were keeping them from helping the poor and sick. If you don't know the story, ask me or ask another member sometime. But the point is that Jesus taught that we should focus on justice, mercy, and faith. The big stuff. The stuff that our church was founded on and was focused on for the last 129 years or so. We've tried to focus less on the human tendency to create and try to hold people to all sides of rules and instead to focus on God's love and grace. Not that all rules are bad, but the idea is that each rule or each law should be evaluated against Christ's teachings. And most laws fall short in that area. Now, I think we do realize that clear, distinct, and strict rules are helpful for some people. Some people need that. Depending on where you're at in your spiritual path, you may be at a place where having strict rules is helpful to keep you from feeling adrift. But from our start, from our birth as a church, almost 130 years ago, St. John's has charted a course that has been different from other churches in this community. It's been a course based on inclusion and love rather than on rules, because too often rules create outsiders. Too often rules push others out. For example, in the early 1900s, there were widely held church rules and laws that were unjust to women. In those days, women could not vote in church. They could not vote in local, state, or federal elections either. Women could not be pastors, and their role in the church was limited in many ways. But this church right here in Owosso in 1917 gave women the right to vote in church elections before women could vote in state or national elections. There are churches to this day that still enforce a rule that women cannot vote in church matters and cannot serve as pastor. Yet Jesus said the highest law is to love God and love neighbor, not to follow rules that marginalize others. St. John, since our inception, has refused to follow rules that we saw as unloving or unhelpful, unless there was a really good reason. Oh, we do have rules. We have our bylaws, and we have our open and affirming statement. These lay out our organizational structure and put into writing our agreed-upon principles of inclusion rather than exclusion. Our rules don't focus on who we will reject. They focus on who we affirm and who we do accept. While other churches have rules that say you can't play cards or let women be pastors, for example, we don't have any rules like that. Our rules are about making sure we follow Jesus' model of inclusion and love for God and love for neighbor. All our neighbors. Rather than having rules that decide who cannot belong, we have rules that facilitate inclusion as long as the safety of everyone is protected. Safety is where we draw the line in terms of inclusion. Our commitment to being a safe place means that we do not accept people who bully, who threaten, who reject, who look down upon others in any way. I mean, we all make mistakes, but as a general rule, that's how we feel. Being a safe place for LGBTQ people has been very important to us because others aren't doing that. And it's particularly important to us right now with what feels like a wave of political developments intended to scapegoat and harm LGBTQ people rather than support them. Both here in the U.S. and around the world, rules or laws aimed directly at LGBTQ people seem to be back on the rise again. For example, Uganda is instituting laws that outlaw being gay, outlaw acting gay, outlaw helping gay people, or advocating for gay people. Now, American Christians have had a lot to do with those African laws because for a long time we have been sending missionaries to Africa who have been teaching anti-LGBTQ ideas, significantly contributing to existing and traditional bigotry in that area. Here in America, the focus lately has been more on gender conformity than on homosexuality. For example, Tennessee recently outlawed drag shows. Anti-gay laws are often passed under the guise of protecting children. You know, if there's no data that shows that drag shows harm anyone, including children. On the other hand, kids are exposed to massive amounts of violence on TV, in video games, in our entertainment, in cartoons. There are decades-long body of scientific evidence that shows the negative public health effects of people being exposed to violence as entertainment, the connection, boy, something clicked. The connection between exposure to violence as entertainment and aggressive or violent thoughts and emotions and behavior have been exposed. We know well what's going on. But for some reason, our society is more concerned that we shield kids from gay and trans folks than we shield kids from violence. Why is that? Part of what's behind these laws is conspiracy theory and homophobia, combined with their usefulness as a wedge issue in pursuit of political power. Also, many people don't understand the difference between a drag show, a particular form of comedy and entertainment, and trans people, real day-to-day people. who are impacted by these things. The effect of this bizarre political obsession with drag queens has been to make trans people a big target, literally making most public places unsafe from verbal, if not physical, abuse. There has also been a recent wave of anti-trans laws passed in several states, particularly regarding gender-affirming medical treatments. Now, this might seem like a weird thing to be talking about in a church, but I bring it up because it's pertinent to how we live out our commitment to inclusion, to loving our neighbor as Jesus taught. Gender-affirming treatments have been around and legal for many years. Right? If a male child needed gender-affirming care, such as added testosterone, or a female child needed more estrogen, that's been done for a long time and never seen as a problem. Right? You can hardly watch late-night TV without seeing some ad aimed at middle-aged men trying to get us to buy drugs to boost our testosterone. Do you have low T? But now that politicians have discovered how these treatments are helpful to trans kids, it's all changed. Right? Now it's a political wedge issue. Now laws are being passed to prevent gender-affirming care, laws that are not based on science or what's beneficial for all. I don't know if most people are familiar with this, but gender-affirming care can only move forward if the kid needs it, if the parents agree, if the doctors and the psychologists all agree. This isn't some willy-nilly thing. There's not somebody from the outside that's administering this somehow. Yet now states are passing laws to take these tools out of parents' hands and giving these decisions, these important medical decisions, to the state, not based on scientific evidence, but based on propaganda and based on conspiracy theory. Politicians who seem to have no problem with kids being exposed to violence and guns freak out over a simple shot of hormones that actually helps the child and hurts nobody. We are a church doing our best to follow Jesus and his teachings. We're not politicians, we're not doctors, at least most of us aren't. Our mission, our calling has always been grace and mercy. If somebody is one gender in their brain and a different gender on the outside of their body, why not allow that to be addressed? Why force someone to conform to old stereotypes instead of the truth of their being as they see it, as they identify it? Historically, laws that target a particular group, right? That's what these are doing. They're targeting a particular group, are generally more about fear than justice, more about power than mercy. These anti-trans laws undermine our trans siblings' safety. It undermines their emotional and spiritual well-being. These are damaging. These are some of the weightier things that Jesus calls us to focus on. We, as an inclusive church, have said no to unjust laws before. And I have a sense that maybe we're being called to do so again. To follow the law of love rather than fear, and to seek not our own advantage in politics or otherwise, but to seek the advantage of the other. For only when love is our guide do we have any hope that our laws are going to be just. Amen.